My name is Joe Kelly, and I'm delighted to be here with Gary and Wilma Davidson as we talk about their life and ministry as it affected Ireland over a 38-year period. Gary and Wilma were the founders of the Assemblies of God movement in Ireland, all over the island, north and south, which has grown to include over 50 churches. Gary passed on the leadership of that movement several years ago and is now working with the missions department of the AG in Oklahoma, which commits over $17 million per annum to worldwide missions to see the church grow, the kingdom expand. Gary and Wilma, thanks so much for being with us this evening. And we're starting this interview mostly about your background and the early years of ministry. Tell me a bit about how you met each other. You guys have been working so closely together. How long are you married now? Is it
Be what? 59 years in
59
2
years?
weeks.
Wow,
Yes,
incredible.
we met when we were 12. I was actually, the first time I met Wilma, I was leading a service in a small church in southeast Oklahoma and giving testimony. And the Lord was really using me, but I still watched this beautiful redheaded girl walk in on the arm of another guy. I didn't really notice her, but she had on this beautiful green outfit, and she looked very good. And I watched her go and sit down, and that's how I first saw her.
So I can see your focus. You were really focused on preaching.
I was focused on the Lord, yes, and His creation.
Well, I remember walking out on the arm of a young man actually that he'd influenced to come back to the Lord. He'd been raised in a Christian home,
Okay.
but had drifted away from the Lord, and Gary helped him come back to his faith.
Yeah.
And he'd come to see me because he and one of my best friends had broke up, and he brought me to church. And I remember walking in that night, and this tall, good-looking guy was leading what we call testimony service back
Right.
then.
Okay.
And different people were popping up and sharing what the Lord had done for them in the last week.
So you did get together, you got married, and at some stage you decided that you were both committed to a life of ministry. How was it that God spoke to you? How did you know that God was calling you to a life of Christian ministry?
I think for me, and I think probably for Wilma as well in her own life, it was a sense from the time I was a young boy. I had a sense of God, although I didn't follow Him all of my teenage years. But something happened. My mother is English. Dad was an American GI. They met during World War II, and East Harling and near Norwich in England. And Dad always said it took a war to get them together, take another one to separate them. And so they got married. And then I was born in England, not knowing how much this would be important in years ahead when I'd end up serving in Ireland and having a European passport. When I was about 10 years old, my mother said to me, "I need to tell you a story." And she said, whenever we came over, Dad came over in September of 1945 after the war, and then Mom and I followed the following April, actually coming into the harbor in New York, April 1946 on a Sunday morning. And Mom said, when we came in, she was so excited because all of these people were gathered, and she thought maybe Ray, my dad, was there to meet her. And she saw these 1,500 women with children, and she asked somebody, "Who are they?" And they said, "Oh, these are girls that got married to American GIs and came to America and found out it's not what they thought it was going to be. Some of the GIs, unfortunately, were already married, whatever, and they were going back disillusioned." My mother said such a fear came on her, and she went to the back of the ship, and she said, "God, I believe you're there, and I believe you care about me and my boy. And I ask that some way, someday, you would touch him and keep him and bless him." Mom told me that when I was 10. I wasn't too excited at 10 about it, but I remember when I was 19 and the Lord was dealing to bring me back into the kingdom, bring me back to His presence, that came back to me. And God answered my mother's prayer in her faith. And I think that put within me a sense. I wish I could say God spoke audibly to me. I always say it was louder than that.
just for me, the calling just seemed to be natural. I grew up in a home, a Christian home, and I had an uncle that was an AG evangelist and pastor, church planner. Actually planted a church very near where we lived, and we often went to church there. So I think it was, that it was just that God calling was in me. And so when I met Gary, and he had this calling, and of course I had a sister as well that was married a pastor, and I admired her very much. She's 13 years older than I am. So it was very natural, I think, that I just accepted his calling and
Yeah.
was ready to go wherever you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people. Your
Isn't that
God will be my God.
what a powerful what a powerful scripture that is, and I think that speaks to so many people, doesn't it? You and your family spent 38 years. I mean, that's quite incredible. 38 years ministering in Ireland. What was it that drew you to Ireland, and were you always certain that that's where God wanted you?
Well, I always had a real heart for the mission field. Prayed for the British Isles and for Ireland. Probably much more for England because that's where I was from, and I would actually imagine myself in the Spirit praying, walking the streets of London, praying for Europe. And so I always had a heart and a passion for that. I didn't know it was going to be Ireland initially, but I had a very good friend that influenced me for the Lord. And I remember we had been pastoring for 8 years, had a good church going in Southeast Oklahoma. And he came for a convention, and I said, Carrie, would you pray with me? I believe God's calling me to go to Europe, to England, that area. And he said he would. So we agreed. We prayed for several months, and then he contacted me and said there is no opportunity to come to England working with the Assemblies of God World Missions, but there is an opportunity perhaps to go to the south of Ireland and develop Teen Challenge. And I remember, Joe, when I received that letter, and Wilma knows that day very well, I was so taken that this was what God wanted, that I was driving. Don't tell the grandkids I was driving reading, but I was. And I pulled over the road, and I sat there probably for half an hour and just wept and cried for Ireland. And God put on my heart. Whenever I came home, and I went into Wilma, she was working away in the house. I put my arms around her and said, I believe God's called us to Ireland. And then she responded.
Was it that simple, or was
Well,
there?
what had happened was about 2 years before. I mean, from the time we got married, he had a heart for missions. I remember before the first year we were married, he was teaching school, and a missionary came from Africa. His name was Brown,
Sure.
and shared. And he asked me, I feel like we're supposed to make a pledge to this missionary. So I think it was $2.50,
$2,
was
yeah,
it?
50 cents.
And we later raised it to $5, but we were making very much. So I knew. So he kept saying, as he said, the missionaries would come through and share, and while we were pastoring, and so one Sunday night we had Sunday night service, and one Sunday night I just went to the front and I cried and cried because we'd taken that church in 1970 in March, and in August my father had passed away. And the next August, 1971, his dad passed away, only 54 years old. So I prayed and I said, Lord, if you want us to leave our mothers, I still can't talk about it without pride. I said, if this is what you want, then I'll go. And I'll say goodbye to my country, to my family, and I'll be willing to go. So when he came and said, I just had peace. I knew this is what God was saying.
What an
And
amazing,
that is so many times, that's what carried us through, knowing God had called us.
Amen.
Yeah. One of one of the things that I invariably do when I get an idea is I try to act straight away, and I usually mess it up, by the way. So, and then have to come back and regroup and say, okay, well, that was a bit too soon. So in a lot of times I get the timing wrong. Um, so I find that God's timing often works at a different pace to mine. That may surprise you, but
I can't believe it. I mean, I can't believe you'd even bring that up here. But
the key principle I want to talk about, has it affected both of you, was there was a call, there was a burden, there was a developing sense of vision out of that burden, but there's also the timing of God.
I just was doing some research, and I found the initial letter I wrote to the Assemblies of God World Missions to ask them about going to Ireland. And I wrote that in January the 31st, 1978. You were just a boy, Joe.
I was only 2.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I wrote that letter, and I got a response February the 15th and said that there was no plans to send anyone there, and but they did sense something in my letter, so they asked would I like to have application. I filled out the application, no obligation from me or them, and we began the process, and we kept following through. Now, to them, Ireland was closed. From what they had said to me, Ireland was closed, and yet I felt we had to pursue what God had put in our heart. I had that tiny light that said there might be a possibility. And so when I sent in my application, and I didn't know this when it happened, but when I sent in my application and they received it the same day, Pastor Bob Edgar from Bethlehem Tabernacle on Shankill Road in Belfast, a member of the region of the Assemblies of God in Northern Ireland, had sent a request saying, we have not been successful in raising up churches in the south of Ireland. We believe there are American missionaries that could be much better at it. And there's my application. Now, that was several months wait, but we just, Abraham waited about 13 years but actually, before we arrived, put our foot on the soil of Ireland, it was 2 years and 5 months from the call till we arrived. But in all of that time, God was working. In the wait, God works.
Yes. And the burden never shifted.
Oh, no, the burden was stronger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was stronger.
So it's kind of that burden staying with you that kept you during those years
Yes.
of waiting. You knew you were coming to Ireland. How did you decide the location, which ultimately meant the people that you were going to work with? Was that clear from the beginning, or how did that unfold for you?
Well, at that time there was a huge move in missions to identify urban areas. Well, obviously, the one city that had over 1 million people was Dublin. So to me, it was obvious we come to Dublin. I had a contact there with Paul and Norma Deere, and they picked us up at the airport, and we worked the first couple of years with them. So I don't think I ever thought about it, except I knew we had to go to the largest city because that was the greatest concentration of people. So we felt it was Dublin, and not realizing Dublin would be our home for nearly the next 40 years.
And we ended up in South Dublin because we were looking for a house that had a telephone. And if you were so young yourself, but at that time in 1980, it could take 2 years to get a phone into your house. So we decided after much searching, we'd take the phone, we'd find a house that had a
I'd
phone, and we'd
forgotten
take
that.
the house that went with it.
Wow.
So, but it,
Seriously.
I actually do remember that time
Yes.
when phones
but
were
it, so it
hard
just
to
so
get.
happened that we found this old vicarage, Church of Ireland Vicarage, that was an old farmhouse that had 12 rooms in it, and it was ideal. We lived upstairs, and we had 2 big rooms downstairs that we could use for meeting rooms.
That
and
was Whiteville House.
that
That was
was
old
White-
Whiteville
that was
House,
Whiteville
yeah.
House, and
That's
we
it.
ended up with over 100 people coming to
so
those.
that's why
prayer
the
meetings.
things that guide us in but
That's
I
it.
do remember Ireland
Yeah.
back those days.
Yeah, and the neat thing now is after all these years, just about 4 years ago, that Sean Booth has planted
No.
Des Curtis has planted a church out there in Ballybrack, where
St. Mark's South.
St. Mark's South,
that's
where
right.
we prayed
Yeah.
those early years.
One of the noticeable things we've worked together for many years, and one of the notable things that I've observed in your ministry is that you've placed a high value on team. How did you go about identifying and gathering your initial team? And do team members always agree on everything?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Joe, you and I are together 40-something years. We never disagreed.
It's true.
But we
would never
did disagree and agree to be agreeable about disagreeing. If I was going to work myself out of a job, if I was going to see an indigenous church raised up, it meant that we had to obviously have identify individuals that God had his hand upon. So from the very outset, I began to pull together, according to 2 Timothy 2:2, where Paul said to Timothy, what I teach you, you teach others, and they teach others, 4 generations. So I immediately began to pull together a group of young men, and I would spend time with them. We started out with the idea, well, we'll meet for 6 weeks. And I remember the first one, we ended up meeting for a year. And I realized it wasn't so much even what I was teaching them, because we would work through some basic teaching materials, but it was what I was modeling to them. And I was actually sharing my life, my own vulnerabilities. And through that, I began to build relationships. And out of that first group, I'm not sure any of them are probably in leadership, but the second group became a leadership group. So it was being able to identify. And I always say this about church planners: you just want to get a few warm bodies in the room, because sometimes you don't have anybody. So if you can get a few warm bodies in the room and identifying and pouring my life into them, and I am relational, I build relationship through that, and then begin to try to identify who actually the Lord has his hand on. Honestly,
So in many ways, it's kind of getting on with the job, building
oh
relationship,
yeah,
and allowing the leaders to emerge.
yeah, just letting the cream come to the top,
Yeah.
I guess, for
Yeah.
want of a better term.
Yeah, and not to get too hung up on it, to give yourself time.
Oh yeah, yeah, and recognize that. And I look back, and some I really had hope for never really made it into leadership. They just didn't have the resilience. They stay to stick with it. I think God keeps trusting you and keeps seeing if you're willing, and then He suddenly gives you these fine young men, including yourself. I mean, Joe, we would have never been where we're at today because I had the ability to connect and get a group together, but you had the ability, you had an administrative ability that could help organize it. And none of us have it all together. So we've got to identify who around us and build team.
We're better together.
Yeah.
And I think with team, we need to understand we're all always not big buddies. We need to realize we're on a life and death mission. To get together and all agree there's probably something wrong. But I think there must be a sense that we can deal with conflict and agree to disagree. You and I went head to head a few times. You've called me into order. I've called you into order. But we were always focused on the task. It wasn't a tit for tat at all, because there was a mutual commitment and respect for each other's gifts. But I can remember when God began to give the vision for the national work, I actually said to you, I can't do this unless you help me, because I knew I couldn't. I had to have somebody with your capability plus a whole group that we were able to gather around us. We look back at those days, they were tough days, but they were good days.
You started a brand new work in the city centre in Dublin, and that depended upon God's provision. It was hugely dependent on God's provision. I mean, there was a sense of the provision for both of you and your family, but there was also the provision of buildings, of everything that went into pulling a church together. Talk to me about generosity, the generosity of the importance of generosity, or the principle of generosity, both in being able to receive, but being generous in the receiving as well.
We're all called to be stewards, and we're called to steward our world. I had this great state, Oklahoma network of AG churches who were willing to believe in my vision, stayed with me, and support me on a monthly, on an annual basis. So that meant when I come there, I had already had the financial wherewithal for myself, for our family, and for the ministry,
And a work budget.
and a work budget to do what we need to do. And initially, obviously, we didn't have a church. We didn't have anybody supporting us locally. But I think from the very outset, I mean, Wilma said that earlier, we supported missionaries. And I believed in the principle of tithing and giving. and I believe that God called us to be stewards of that. So I believe we were, and to get where we got with St. Mark's, I think was because whenever we began in our home in Castle Knott with 12 people. And, I think the last day of '85, we gathered in our home. There were only 12 people, and it began to grow and grow quickly. And before long, we had nearly 100 people, and we'd started meeting in the city. We were looking for facility and believing the Lord to provide for it, but we didn't have the finance to do it. I was huge on relationships, and I was willing to relate to any. And the Lord brought a man in my life, Eamon Donnelly, and Eamon was very successful, a businessman. His wife came to the Lord, was influenced by our Bible teaching. She knew the Lord when she came to us, and I began to build a relationship with Eamon. And over the years, Eamon came to the Lord because of the influence of his wife, Tempe. And he and I became very close. I would meet him regularly, but he was a very influential businessman. And so whenever we began to look for a building, we were renting a building. If you remember, we grew so quickly that we moved into ballroom of a pub, and then our children met in a building next to us. We'd leave our children, come 50 yards or 100 yards, and as soon as our meeting was over, we'd rush back over to get our children. But we needed a place, and St. Mark's came on the market, and it was because of his influence we were able to buy it, but because of that relationship. But we didn't have the funds. We were blessed that we had a couple in our church when they found it that actually took the redundancy and actually helped us pay the money down. So I think there was that element of sacrifice as well as that element of generosity among us.
Yes.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, so it was a two-way thing. There
It
was
was,
there was
yes.
the willingness to receive and
Yes.
to be the recipients of that
Yes.
blessing, but at the same time not hoarding everything.
Oh, no,
But
no.
always that willingness to bless others as well.
I think Gary's always been very generous. When we first took the church back in Oklahoma, those early years, so many of the people that we had in the beginning were widows, and they drew state income, and it was very hard for him to accept their tithe.
Yeah.
But he finally had to realize they were blessed by giving.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that has helped us through the years to realize, uh, people, you have to accept what people want to give because God's going to bless them.
And that's the way God's economy works.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. Well, actually, the very first big meeting we did in March, if you remember, was actually a missions banquet.
Right.
And everybody brought their dishes, you remember?
Were you there for that?
I certainly
You
was.
were,
yes.
and brought the dishes,
Yeah.
and I know I heard
Brought our
some
own food.
wives say, we will not do this next year, but there was 298 at that.
We actually put a couple of tables up on the balconies because we couldn't fit everybody.
And all the funds we gave to a mission in Africa. And I remember when David Hamilton, who had just got out of prison and had become a Christian and was an evangelist, and he had very little. And he told me once that when he first got out of prison, he was remarried, started a family, and was doing evangelism. He had been a Protestant terrorist. And, he said that he would have never made it if it had been for a church like St. Mark's that underwrote him, So there was a generosity in Mark's. And from the beginning.
In talking about generosity, were there any significant events, significant amounts of money that came in to really get St. Mark's started in Dublin City?
See, I've always felt that in Europe, I had a friend of mine who was working in Africa, and they were buying lots for $5,000 to build churches on. Imagine that. That's barely for the hire for a place. And so I knew we had to have significant funds come in at critical times. So when we bought St. Mark's, a dear lady had actually shared with me a vision 6 years before of the building, and it full of Irish people. So it was on the market. Trinity was trying to sell it because of difficulties in the area with security and drugs. And they'd used it as a lecture hall, map storage building, and they just wanted to get rid of it. It was outside their main footprint. So they asked $125,000 for it. Pounds. I offered them 110. Imagine that. Offered them 110,000. They turned me down. offered them 110 again. They turned me down. The third time, I called my old friend, Eamon Dahl, and they said, "Do you know somebody?" An hour later, I got a call from the state agent stating that they had accepted the offer 110. And I mean, we think about it now. I mean, it's invaluable, the property. But I had about 30,000 or so in the state, and this couple gave a significant that helped me to secure the actual sale in Ireland. And then I had to find well over 100,000. And I actually took out a loan in the States to buy the place, but then I was responsible to pay the loan back. And, so that was, so I'm in Ireland. We're building the church. You know, it was taking off. People are being coming to the Lord. People are being baptized. There was great growth, but I'm having to make this significant payment, and I didn't have time to really fundraise. But a friend of mine came over and saw the nature of our work and was impressed. He actually was, when he came back to America as an Assemblies of God pastor, he was visiting one of his people in the hospital, an older lady that had just joined their church. She said to him, "Pastor, I have some money I'd like to leave to missions." And so he encouraged her to leave it uh, for uh, for missions work. He didn't designate it at first, and he had no idea. The lady actually had left $250,000. And so he was contacted and asked about the money, how it would go. And he asked that it pay off our loan. And so suddenly our whole loan is paid off.
Wow. What a
I'm
provision.
suddenly out from under all that pressure.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That really is amazing.
Huge blessing.
And then we think of Mark's today, 800 to 1,000 people there, the finances that are even generated from the car park.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
is a bit unbelievable.
That is quite incredible. Can you talk to us about prayer and what part it played in the development of the ministry in Ireland?
Well, for us personally, actually, when we met, it was actually through a prayer meeting. A group of women got together to pray, and the Lord sent revival to this small community that it touched, influenced Wilma and I greatly. So we saw the power of prayer, and Wilma had seen it in the life of her family growing up. But I sensed the power of prayer. So from the moment that God called us to Ireland, even when it looked like the door was closed, we dedicated every Thursday for fasting and prayer, which we have kept to this time. Some weeks it doesn't work out, so we go with a different, but we both have believed strong in the power of prayer. And the interesting thing on St. Mark's, when it was deconsecrated in 1971 as a Church of Ireland, there was a couple of dear evangelical ladies in the church, and they went to the Archbishop and said, "You can't close our church. It's been here since, 1746. They said, "No, you can go to St. Anne's Church. It's only a few streets up." And so my understanding, I never met these dear ladies, was that they said, "Well, we'll go to a higher power." So from 71 to 85, these dear ladies met and prayed once a month for 2 hours for St. Mark's to become once again a place of evangelism and ministry. Obviously, God answered their prayer. And when I look back, like whenever we set out one of our first church plant, that they actually ended up meeting in an old disused Methodist chapel that had become a community center. And we found out that two of our great friends that we all have honor and respect, Noah McFarland, who's in heaven now, and Brian Watkins, who now lives in Wales, old man, retired. Here I'm talking about an old man, I'm aging myself. But anyway, they would meet in that building and pray. And then Noel starts his church there. So prayer
Oh,
was
that's
just,
amazing
yeah.
and quite incredible.
And also, before we ever got to Ireland, there was the Lydia prayer group was already developed, and they prayed so much for men to be raised up. And I've just been amazed.
Yeah.
Our whole ministry in Ireland at how many men,
Yeah.
because a lot of times tends to be more women than men, but all of our churches, I think, tend to have as many men or more than women.
Yeah. So prayer is
Prayer.
foundational. It unlocks opportunity and
Yeah.
creates open doors.
Gary has a great story about our prayer meetings that we had regularly in St. Mark's of a drug addict finding his way into, just because there was a light on the church and we were having a prayer meeting. Steve Heavey.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And, we always had every fall, we had a week of prayer. In the spring, we'd often have a week of prayer. We had the prayer watch. There was a lot of prayer in Marks and a lot of, you remember early years, we'd stand and pray. We'd pray to the east and to the north and the south and the west. But I also recognized, because I'd done some study of the AG work there, history, and found out the first 3 pastors that tried to start AG Works all died tragic. And one had died of cancer, but 2 were in their 20s, young men, and one of them was crushed in a lumber yard where he was working to supplement his income, and the other was killed in a car accident. I remember hearing that and actually feeling fear about it. I thought, yeah, I mean, we don't understand all of these things, but we do have an enemy. And I remember contacting my friend, and we all know him well, Ben Tipton, and having him come a couple of times and teach us about spiritual warfare. And of course, the Lydia group was great into that. And I'm convinced that it was those people, and a lot of the brethren, the old brethren movement there, were great people of prayer. And I think God answered their prayer by sending revival to the charismatic renewal of the Catholic Church. And it was a bit difficult for them to recognize. I mean, you were influenced by it. So many in our early leaders by that power of prayer. And I think by their praying. But I remember we were having this prayer time, and a couple the coors that were working with us come in late, and this young man just sitting there, stoned out of his head. And they invited Stephen, to come upstairs and to the prayer. And when he walked in, everybody was praying, and he was a bit overwhelmed. And somebody turned around and prayed towards him. Trish McDonough prayed a prayer towards him with her eyes closed. I didn't realize it, like a prophetic prayer. And he fell on his knees and actually asked Christ to come into his life. We sent him off to Teen Challenge. And, just this year, he's been ordained as a minister in an Assemblies of God church in Wales, and he and Ashley lead the church there. But it was all out of prayer.
It's great to see how it worked and how God really answered all those prayers over the years that have been sown.
And still,
The exciting bit, governance.
Oh, governance, yes.
So talk to us a bit about governance and oversight. I'm conscious that, well, first of all, how important is it? But I'm conscious that governance oversight can both hinder and help. That it's trying to strike the right balance between creating the right framework within which ministry can grow, but it can also bring risks in if it becomes too controlling. How did governance and oversight work in the ministry in Ireland?
The Assemblies of God churches here would be a bit more like the Presbyterian. And so you'd have local church membership. They would vote. They would actually vote on their pastors. And so here we're going in a brand new church of brand new Christians that have no background in church governance or anything. So, we went with an eldership-based church government, and the visionary leader, the lead pastor, is the first among equals, was kind of the term we used in those early years. That was much more acceptable because people had left the denominations, and the last thing they wanted is something else denominational. And thankfully, we've always seen our movement here as a group of autonomous fellowships that each one has their local autonomy, but they come together basically for the vision to reach the world with the gospel. We can do it better together, all of us, pooling our resources and sitting. And that was the whole catalyst behind the Assemblies of God in the beginning. So I was strong on local autonomy, even when we began to start our churches. And then we had the eldership that met together. We would inform the people about what we felt God was doing, ask them to pray about it, things like that. But at the end of the day, the governance was within the eldership that was there. And then when we began to put together a constitution and things that you need as you grow, Otherwise, if you don't have banks for a river, you have a swamp, a meandering river, or so that has to be the banks, but they can't restrict, but they need to give some guidance and direction. Otherwise, you have chaos. That was the way we moved forward with it. And sometimes individuals will say, well, the Constitution is what's important. The Constitution and the bylaws are there to serve the church. If they restrict it, then they need to be changed. And so we went with that. And I know whenever we appointed deacons, we actually asked the church to select, and then the eldership did the appointment. But I remember whenever we did, remember the person that got the largest group of largest affirmation was actually one of our ladies. And then, of course, you remember those days we made that transition where we have always felt that anointing is, it's not about gender, it's about anointing. And so that we actually brought in our first woman elder. And that was a journey for us. But as an eldership, you remember on critical decisions, we had to be unanimous.
Yes.
Because we felt we had to walk out of that room saying we're all on the same. And I remember we were going to make a decision about bringing someone in as eldership, and one of our brothers, Noel, didn't have peace, and I was really aggravated. And I remember within 3 months we realized it was a mistake. But a year later, we made that decision. You were a big part of that. We were all together, and it changed everything whenever we begin to recognize that role.
One of the things a couple of things that strike me from what you're saying. One is that the Constitution of whatever it is we have set up is there to serve what we're doing, not the other way around.
Is what? It's to
It's
serve
there
us,
to,
yes.
so it's like one of the things which isn't often considered is that as a ministry grows and adapts, its framework needs to grow and adapt as
That's right.
well.
Yes.
Its constitutional model needs to be changed. This is not something that's fixed in stone, but it needs to bend and shape to support the changing model of the ministry that's developing.
Yes.
That's actually quite critical. And in many cases, places have gotten stuck because their constitution has remained rigid
Yes.
while their ministry is trying to burst out of the seam.
New wineskins, isn't that what
Yes.
Jesus said?
Yeah, I think that probably sums it up pretty well. There was a time when God began to nudge you beyond what had become quite a successful ministry in St. Mark's and begin to look out to the country and start to build a network of churches and see new church planting. And that is what has become CCI now. How did God speak to you about that? Can you tell us the differences between good local church ministry and what needs to be considered when it's time to start expanding and look for new horizons?
Some of that was like the Macedonian call to Paul, because I still remember getting a call. I mean, we had the old voicemail or voice machine. Is that what we had those
Yes,
days?
we had them on our telephones.
Yeah, on our
yes, yeah.
telephone. And I came in one day and somebody'd come in and it'd be a dozen messages. I was listening to my messages, and this man come on and said, Pastor Gary, this is Pat Murphy, Pastor Pat Murphy in Wexford. It was Wexford, yeah, Wexford. And he said, I have a church going down here, and people are coming in and causing real chaos. And said, I was talking to Pastor P.J. Booth and Pastor Stephen Bonds, and they said, what I need is an oversight. And so I said, give me a time and I'll come down and do a service for you, and we'll just start the journey. So we did. And I started the journey. And so churches I hadn't actually started, he had about 20, 25 people. Churches I hadn't started came and asked, would we give some oversight? And it was interesting because he told me after that, he had everybody come in and preach for him. And I said, why don't you contact me from now on? And maybe I know some people that can help you. And so he said, guys would call him and say, can I come and preach for you? God's given me a word. And he'd say, well, you have to call Gary Davidson first. And he said, a couple of them said, that'll be useless, and hung up on him. So obviously they were troublemakers,
Okay.
and that blessed him. And of course, we began to teach. I went in and taught them leadership. Different ones of us went down. In fact, you and I went down, and when we laid hands on an ordained, recognized God's ordination on him, and laid hands on him, and dedicated the new church, and so on. And I think that began to say, you
With
got to
the
do
me.
much. There was it
There
was
was a
kind
me
of like
about
they're asking me to do it, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and they just kept coming to our door. And then, I remember one year at Mosney, Together for the Kingdom, you actually came to me. I don't know if you remember this. You had a word for me, and you said, Gary, you're going to have to go to the country. And I had heard that prophetic word was given me at least 3 different times. And I remember actually coming to you and saying, well, I can't do it unless I got someone like you beside me. And because we need all the gifts, we're going to build this network. And so we started that journey. And then obviously we began to send churches out, and they kept relating back to us. We gave them oversight, governance, and whether it was Liberty Church with Noel and Sharon, or Open Arms, or with PJ and Liz, and we began that journey. And then others that related to them then asked for us for oversight. I never went there with the idea that I would do anything like this, Joe.
So it was really, people could see what was being modeled and say, we'd like some of that, please.
That's what they
That's
wanted.
essentially it, isn't it?
Yes.
And then began to approach you to say, look, we like what you're doing. We need to up our game a little bit, or to change
Yes.
our approach, or to do something. Can you help us? And that's how the initial network started.
That did. And then
Yeah.
we would do I'd do leadership meetings for overnights. Sometimes we paid the whole cost, bring in a good pastor, leader, teacher from America or from the UK. So that way begin to build camaraderie, and begin to, and then we would, we allowed people in March to come along and belong even without believing. And we developed this relational network.
Yes.
You were a big part of it. We asked people, we would invite people to come, and they'd say, well, I'm not a part of it. Well, just come along. I think we called it, what we say, we need to start courting before we get engaged.
But there's also a principle that very much is obvious in your ministry, and that is the focus you place on relationship. And look, I increasingly I talk to people about this and say, when we come back and we look at some of the big issues as to what's important, let's come back to the scripture when Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself." Clearly, it's all about relationship. Both of you have always been very relational, and I think you placed relationship at a higher level than organization.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I would think that was probably a very, very important part of the success of the development of the ministry. And I don't mean success in terms of this is fantastic, but it has grown, and it has been a blessing to the country and continues to be. So relationship was always key to you.
Well, people that left the most traditional and biggest denominations in the world, or in the world, and then suddenly they come in, and they weren't going to be told what to do. And even whenever we begin to recognize a national leader, some just couldn't go there, and that's fine. Everybody, to each his own. Everybody couldn't go into the promised land. And I'm not saying we're the promised land, but you know what I'm saying. So, and I had to recognize some couldn't go and some didn't. But I think one thing that really helped us in those early years, Wilma has this tremendous gift of hospitality, and we all have it. But I said, when I write my book, I will do a chapter on put the kettle on, because we all in Ireland know what that means. And I think Wilma had such a welcoming, and obviously I had it, our children had it. When people come in, we just, that's who we are. I mean, I don't know how many apple fritters or pies that she baked over the years. And
Those early years, we happened to have apple trees in that little property.
Oh, yeah, because you guys were always great gardeners. I remember that.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
especially
Well,
Gary. I
yeah,
think he's
nearly as
always.
good. Well, you taught me, Joe.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Just for anybody watching, we were both hopeless at gardening.
That's right. Well, Joe did have a rose. He did have a rose that he trimmed regularly and spoke about it each Sunday morning as he led.
That was the only illustration I think I
That
ever
was
used.
the only
Yeah.
ad.
Well, one of the things that we will speak about in more depth a little bit later on, but we came to a place where the network's beginning to emerge, and I suppose maybe that's the best way to put it.
Yeah.
But you also began to see that new focus needs to be placed now on developing this network and encouraging the work around the country. So succession became really, really important. And this goes back, Wilma, to what you were saying early. From the very start, you were working to work yourself out of a job. At what point did you begin to see that you needed to you needed to look for someone to take on the work in St. Mark's to be able to free you up to move on to or to focus on the country?
I think that was in the background all the time, wasn't it?
Well, I remember Wilma saying a young man stood up at St. Bridget's.
Which was an initial prayer meeting
Yeah, that we
at the
did
very beginning.
Started
Yeah.
in
82 and
Yeah.
80, and she said, that may be our Solomon, or David for the Solomon, and so on. 83, we were already looking.
Okay. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, and so that was
And it was
part of it. Go ahead.
we had a young man that walked with us for 12 years and worked in St. Mark's, but in the end, we realized he wasn't the one. Well, he realized
He realized it, yeah.
He realized he wasn't the one and came to Gary and told him.
And that's a different. And I've always had huge respect for someone that can say, "I'm not the one."
Yes. Yeah.
It's the John the Baptist spirit, it's the Jonathan spirit.
Yeah.
I could be crown prince, but no, David's the one.
Yes.
And recognizing that.
But it was one of the pastors that we had sent out and sent Sean and Susan Malarkey with him that came to Gary and said,
He said,
Stephen Mons came and said,
you've got to
right,
find.
I
okay.
have the successor for Stephen.
You've
Okay.
got to find some, Gary, you've got to go to the country. And I said, I can't leave Mark's till I have the right person. He said, I've got the right couple.
Yeah.
And we had been praying for 6 months.
And what's worth noting about that
Yeah.
and we will talk, because I think succession is a really important topic, but we will talk about it later in a subsequent video. It was 20 years before you handed over.
Yeah.
If I could say that there was never a sense in any of that time that you were grabbing and holding on to something, but there was the timing, again, the timing of God in this. There's a time when things are maturing, when things are being put in place, and it's time to change the focus or move on. But God has the right person to step in. And what an answer to prayer Sean Malarkey was.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And anybody who knows Sean will know that that's true. We're going to wrap up now on this particular video. On our next video, we're going to talk about we're going to start looking at the personal attributes of emerging and young leaders. And I think what we're trying to do in the next video is to show people what are the characteristics, the character traits and the personal habits of people. What do they need to be if you're going to develop a ministry? And look at what Gary and Wilma both had running in their lives to see what they did and maybe to learn from some of those things. There are several other videos on the way as well, looking at different aspects of this work. So we do encourage you to continue. Maybe if you're watching this for the first time, you could if you hit the subscribe button, you'll be notified of the next videos coming out and you'll be able to follow the series. So thanks for watching, and we will follow up very soon with our next video on the personal life of an emerging and young leader. God bless you all.